The diner was loud with the morning rush when Keisha froze mid-step. A 5-year-old white boy sat slumped over his pancakes, his tiny hand trembling as he tried to lift his fork. His father, a tall man in a designer suit, didn't notice. He was too busy barking orders into his Bluetooth headset. Then it happened again. The boy's left arm dropped, motionless. Keisha's breath caught. She had seen this before. Same tilt, same half smile that didn't reach both sides of face. Her heart pounded. "Sir," she shouted, voice cutting to the clatter of dishes. "Your son needs help now." The man looked up, stunned. "What did you just say?" Keisha stepped closer. "He's not fine, sir. His arm isn't moving. His speech is enough." The man snapped, yanking the child away. "You're just a waitress. Stay in your lane." His words hit like a slap, but worse came when his gold watch clipped her cheek, sending a burst of pain across her face. Gasps echoed. The boy whimpered. Keisha pressed a napkin to her cheek, but didn't back down. "He's having a stroke. Please call an ambulance before it's too late." The manager rushed in, panic on his face. "Mr. Mercer, I'm so sorry. She's new. I'll handle this." Handle this? Keisha stared at them both. The billionaire father, the apologetic boss. Nobody saw what she saw. Nobody cared that a child was dying in front of them. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I've seen this before. I lost someone once because nobody listened." The man scoffed, pulling his son closer. "Keep your staff away from my family." And with that, he stormed out, leaving behind a bleeding waitress, a fallen napkin, and the echo of a boy's weak cry. Keisha stood frozen, heart shaking. The boy's face, pale loss, burned into her mind. She knew those signs. She knew what came next. And even if the world refused to listen to a black woman in an apron, she would find a way to make them see. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. Keisha walked home in silence, the weight of what just happened pressing on her chest like a stone. The autumn wind stung her cheek, where his watch had hit, but that wasn't what hurt most. It was the sound of that little boy's voice, slurred and weak, the same sound she had once heard from her own brother, Malik. Her small apartment sat on the edge of Richmond's east side, the kind of place where dreams came cheap and rent came late. Inside, the light flickered when she flipped the switch. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paint. She tossed her apron on the couch and stood by the window, staring at the cracked streetlight outside. The echo of Malik's laughter filled her memory. 12 years old, always smiling, always running. Until the day his legs gave out in the school gym. She could still hear her mother's voice screaming for help. The school nurse had said, "It's just dehydration." The paramedics arrived too late. The doctors had whispered the words that never left her mind. Pediatric stroke. No one had believed her mother when she said something was wrong. No one had listened because they were poor, and they were black. That's when Keisha quit nursing school. Not because she didn't care, but because every hallway reminded her of the one where Malik took his last breath. She'd taken up waitressing to survive, but that fire, that instinct, never left her. She could still spot the signs in an instant. And today, she'd seen them again, in that little boy, in that diner, in front of everyone too blind to notice. Keisha sank into her worn-out chair and buried her face in her hands. The sting of humiliation mixed with fury. They called her crazy, but deep down, she knew she was right. She wiped her tears and opened her old laptop. Its screen cracked at the corner. "Pediatric stroke symptoms." She typed again, her fingers trembling. The same checklist appeared. Facial droop, arm weakness, slurred speech. All of them matched. Keisha closed the lid slowly, a new kind of resolve building in her chest. If nobody else was going to help that boy, she would. She didn't know how yet, but she wasn't about to watch another child die because a black woman's voice wasn't enough. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the Mercer estate, all glass, marble, and silence. Inside, Ethan Mercer sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his phone screen instead of his reflection. Every headline felt like an accusation waiting to happen. He had built his empire by staying in control. Numbers, markets, people. But now, the image replayed in his head like a curse. That waitress's eyes, the bruise on her cheek, and her words. He's having a stroke. He shook it off, turned toward the hallway. Caleb, breakfast. No answer. He found his son sitting on the floor of his room, pajamas wrinkled, holding his toy car awkwardly with one hand. The other arm hung limp by his side. Ethan's heart stopped. "Buddy, what's wrong?" "My arm feels weird," Caleb whispered. "It won't move." Ethan knelt beside him, forcing a smile that felt like glass. "Maybe you just slept on it funny." But when he touched his son's hand, it was cold and unresponsive. He froze. Her voice echoed again. "He's in danger." Ethan called his assistant. "Get me the nearest children's hospital, now." But the receptionist on the line said the same thing 3 times. "Earliest appointment is next week." Next week? His stomach turned. He paced the room, guilt rising with every breath. The boy winced again, saying softly, "Daddy, my head hurts." Ethan's eyes filled with something unfamiliar. Fear. He grabbed his keys and coat, scooping Caleb into his arms. "Hang on, buddy. We're going right now." Halfway down the staircase, his phone buzzed. News alert. Billionaire berates waitress after alleged diner incident. Witnesses claim racial bias. The article showed a blurred photo of him holding Caleb, and behind him, that same waitress, bleeding, terrified, reaching out. For a long second, Ethan couldn't move. His throat tightened as he realized how it looked, and worse, how it truly was. A man too proud to listen, and a woman too brave to stay silent. He clenched his jaw. "Not this time," he muttered, and pushed through the front door. "If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe." The hospital waiting room buzzed with low murmurs and cold fluorescent light. Ethan hurried to the front desk, his son limp in his arms. "Please, my boy can't move his arm." The nurse looked up, startled. "We'll take him right in." As the nurse guided him down the hallway, a familiar voice froze him in place. Keisha stood near the corner, clutching a clipboard she'd borrowed from triage. Her uniform from the diner was gone, replaced by a plain sweatshirt and resolve written across her face. When their eyes met, he faltered. "You?" She nodded once. "You brought him? Good." Ethan swallowed hard. He woke up like this. "I didn't know what—" "You did the right thing," she said softly, interrupting his guilt before it consumed him. Her tone wasn't angry now. It was focused, calm, professional. The nurse called out, "Dr. Reeves will see you immediately." Keisha followed behind, ignoring confused glances from staff. When they reached the exam room, the boy whimpered, "My head hurts." Keisha crouched beside him, her voice steady. "I know, sweetheart. We're going to make it stop soon." Dr. Reeves rushed in, checked reflexes, eyes, speech, the same checklist Keisha had memorized years ago. Ethan's face drained of color as the doctor spoke. "Possible neurological event. We need imaging now." Keisha exhaled, almost whispering, "Finally." As they wheeled the boy away, Ethan turned to her, his voice low. "You tried to tell me. I didn't listen." Keisha met his gaze, no anger, only tired empathy. People rarely do until it's their child. The elevator doors closed, leaving only their reflections in the metal, one broken by guilt, the other hardened by experience. When the doors opened again, they stepped into the ambulance bay together. Ethan hesitated before climbing in. "You know what's happening better than anyone here," he said quietly. "Would you ride with us?" Keisha blinked. "You want me to come?" He nodded. "I think we both know this isn't luck. It's faith." She climbed in without a word, taking the seat beside the boy as the siren wailed to life. The ambulance's siren wailed through the Virginia night, slicing through traffic as red lights painted the inside walls. Keisha sat beside the stretcher, eyes locked on the monitor flashing Caleb's heartbeat. Ethan sat opposite her, elbows pressed to his knees, face pale and hollow. He looked nothing like the billionaire who'd humiliated her yesterday, just a terrified father now, stripped of arrogance. "I didn't listen," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Keisha didn't answer. She was watching the boy's breathing, shallow but steady. "He told me his arm felt heavy last week," Ethan continued, "but I thought he just wanted attention." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "You're not the first parent who missed the signs," she said quietly, "but you're one of the few who came back." He nodded, guilt settling heavier with every mile. "I have money, doctors, everything, yet I didn't see what you did." "Money doesn't teach you how to notice pain," Keisha replied. "That takes empathy, not power." The paramedic called out, "BP's dropping slightly. Prepare oxygen." Keisha leaned closer to Caleb. "Stay with me, sweetheart. You're doing so good." The boy's eyelids fluttered weakly, his voice small. "I'm scared." Her throat tightened. "I know, baby, but you're strong. You've got two people fighting for you now." Ethan turned to her, eyes wet. "How do you stay this calm?" "Because I've lived the other version," she said softly, "the one where nobody listens." Her words hit him harder than any accusation. The hospital came into view, a red brick fortress glowing against the night. The ambulance braked, doors swung open, and a team of nurses rushed in with a gurney. "Let's move," one shouted. As they rolled Caleb through the corridor, Keisha ran beside them, keeping her voice steady. "Tell the doctor he's showing clear signs of pediatric stroke, left side paralysis, and slurred speech." The staff nodded, taking her words seriously this time. Ethan followed, breath ragged, gripping his son's toy car in one shaking hand. When they reached the doors, a doctor stopped him. "Sir, you can't come in yet." Ethan's voice cracked. "Just save my boy." Keisha placed a hand on his arm. "They will, because this time he's not invisible." The clock in the pediatric waiting room ticked louder than it should have. Ethan sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, his face buried in trembling hands. He hadn't prayed in 20 years, but tonight he found himself whispering words he barely remembered. Across from him, Keisha sat quietly, holding a paper cup of burnt coffee she hadn't touched. Her eyes followed the red line on the floor that led to the operating wing. Every time the double doors opened, both of them looked up. Every time, it wasn't for them. She said it's a bypass procedure, Ethan muttered. Something about restoring blood flow. Keisha nodded gently. Moya disease. It's rare but treatable. You got him here in time. Her tone was calm, but her fingers twisted nervously around the cup. He looked at her for a long moment. You studied medicine once, didn't you? Her eyes flickered with memory. I did. My brother didn't survive what your son is fighting now. I promised myself I'd never stand by again. Silence stretched between them. Then Ethan exhaled shakily. I thought being powerful meant being right. That if I controlled everything, nothing bad could touch my family. Keisha's voice softened. Control doesn't stop tragedy. Compassion does. Listening does. He nodded, swallowing hard. You saw what I couldn't, because you cared enough to look. And because I've lost enough to never look away again. The double doors finally opened. Dr. Reeves appeared, mask lowered, eyes tired but calm. Mr. Mercer? Ethan leapt to his feet. The procedure was successful, she said. We were able to reroute blood flow to the brain. Your son's stable, and he's asking for you. For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. His body sagged with relief, and he laughed. A broken, grateful sound. Keisha smiled quietly, tears in her eyes. Dr. Reeves turned to her. You're the waitress from the diner? Yes, ma'am. Then you should know you saved that boy's life. If you hadn't recognized those signs, the outcome could have been very different. Keisha looked away, voice trembling. I just did what anyone should have done. Ethan shook his head. No, you did what no one else did. You saw us, even when I refused to see you. He wiped his eyes, emotion breaking through pride. You have my respect. Forever. 2 weeks later, sunlight poured through the tall windows of Ethan Mercer's penthouse, soft, golden, almost forgiving. The sound of laughter echoed from the kitchen. something this house hadn't heard in months. Caleb stood on a stool, stirring pancake batter with his good hand, while his father hovered behind him. "Easy, champ," Ethan said, smiling. "We don't want flour on the ceiling again." Caleb giggled. "Then stop cooking like a mad scientist, Dad." A knock on the door, followed by a familiar voice, made them both turn. "Permission to enter the lab?" Keisha stepped in, holding a paper bag and her usual gentle grin. "Still bringing that fancy bakery syrup, huh?" Ethan teased. "Still pretending you know how to cook, huh?" She shot back playfully. Caleb laughed, so hard his spatula dropped into the bowl. She helped him wipe it up, careful not to strain his healing arm. "How's the strength today?" she asked. "Better," he said proudly. "Miss Dana, my therapist, says I'll be back to two hands soon." Ethan leaned against the counter, watching them with quiet gratitude. He wasn't a man from the diner anymore, not the voice of arrogance, but of humility. The scandal that once filled headlines had turned into something else, a redemption story. "I saw the news clip," Keisha said softly. "You didn't have to mention me." "I did," Ethan replied. "People needed to know what really saved him. Not my money, not the hospital. You." She looked down, smiling faintly. "Then I hope they learn to listen next time." Caleb looked between them, eyes bright. "Can Miss Keisha come to my school play next week?" Ethan chuckled. "I already told her she is front row." "Good," the boy said proudly, "because I'm the narrator now. I tell the story. Keisha met 8 on size. That's exactly what the world needs, more truth tellers." He nodded. "And more people like you." They stood there, 3 lives bound together by a moment that changed everything. Proof that courage and compassion can outshine privilege and pride. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.